Okay, so welcome to part 8 of the 2007 Mackyard Incident Series, where we're also going to be looking into issues of Transport Canada's complete and total negligence, causing death, in my opinion, in the rail industry because of their failure to do their job. Okay, as we continue with the deceptions in this one paragraph, which is found in the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to the Mackyard incident of 2007, I want to bring to your attention what we're going to be focusing on in this particular video, and that is the stuff that's underlined in green. The fact that the date that the regulation supposedly went into effect was March 16th, 1987. Now note here, they're telling you the name of the regulation is the QSOC, or the Railway Employee Qualification Standards for Operating Crew Regulation. That is not the name of the regulation. The regulation's name is the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. And you're going to note, just as they're currently overhauling that regulation to update it after 38 years, they're going to give it a very similar name to the old one. And here they gave this name a very similar name to the actual name of the real regulation. It's not QSOC, Standards for Operating Crews. It is the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. There is no regulation known as QSOC, and I will clearly show you that. But remember the date, March 16th, 1987. And then where it says that it specifies that training programs must be filed with Transport Canada Rail Safety Directorate along with any changes or alterations to the program. That's true, but what must be filed there is very different than what the Act, the Railway Safety Act, stipulates must be filed with Transport Canada. Very different in what must be filed. And so for them to say, well, this regulation says this needs to be filed, they're not focusing here on the Act. If they did focus on the Act, you would see that Transport Canada is not doing its job. And that, in my opinion, is what's causing deaths in the rail industry. And so, we want to take the focus off Transport Canada. So this is one of the ways they do it. They change the name of the regulation and they divert your attention from where it should go to the Act, the Railway Safety Act, and refer you just to a lower level law, a regulation that has very different stipulations as far as what must be filed when it comes to frontline rail worker training programs. And the other thing is that the regulation which applies for frontline rail worker training programs, SOR 87-150, they also hide that. They hid it for decades under the Canadian Transportation Act and the Canadian Transportation Agency, rather than having that regulation show up under the Transport Canada website. Why did they do that? It's another way to deceive people, folks. If you don't know the real name of the regulation, are you going to notice what it is? Are you really going to go out there and find it if you're doing research trying to put all these pieces of the puzzle together? Likely not. Most people would not spend the time, the years that I have spent looking into these issues to put these pieces together. And the other issue is, again, Transport Canada reviews these reports before they are made public. And so why would they not have corrected these deceptions? Transport Canada knows the proper name of the regulation. They know where it was. They're quietly trying to move it from the Canadian Transportation Agency. They removed it from there. They're quietly trying to rewrite it and put it under the Railway Safety Act, which would then fall under Transport Canada. And the only reason they're doing that is because of all this research that I've done and exposed so many violations of so many laws by Transport Canada and their complete and total failure to do their job in reviewing and approving changes to training programs, in doing compliance audits to make sure people weren't being fake qualified, and on and on and on. And so diverting the attention from the act down to the regulation helps to take the heat off Transport Canada. And that is what we're going to be looking at in this particular discussion. So again, just to recap, if you look under the Railway Safety Act, you will see that the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150, isn't there. If you look at the green arrows there, that's where it should be. The one, look at the left. Then at the right, it would have fallen coincidentally at the same spot. There's no regulation called QSOC, or the Qualification Standards for Operating Crews. That's not there either under current regulations under the Railway Safety Act. That's because the regulations pertaining to frontline rail worker training programs, the Enabling Act was not the Railway Safety Act. They hid it under the Canadian Transportation Act, which was primarily administered by the Canadian Transportation Agency, which could be headed by a rail executive, as it was during the time of the Mackyard incident through the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and beyond. And so they put the fox in charge of the hen house, in other words. So you can see that neither SOR 87-150 or QSOC falls under the Railway Safety Act. And if you look at the bottom here, in the very bottom, I took this screen print in September 15th of 2025. Sorry, I have bad eyes, so I had 5 surgeries. So sometimes I go off screen. But anyways, that's a current screen print. Where's the regulation? If this is the regulation that's really under this act. And a lot of this regulation is quite old. Some of it dates back to 1979, so where is the, the regulation for these two supposed regulations, and especially the QSOC regulation, which doesn't even exist? And I will prove that to you. Now, if you look under the Canadian Transportation Agency website, which is a screen print I have here. Again, this was taken on September 15th, 2025. And look at that. Neither regulation is there. You don't see the qualification standards for operating crews, and you don't see the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, or SOR 87-150. Why not? Shouldn't one of these regulations be there? What's going on? Let's see. Okay, so you have 2 screen prints here. One is a screen print that I had done in 2024, before Chrystia Freeland, our now Minister of Transportation, decided to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which has not been modified in 38 years. So where is it? It's not appearing under the current Railway Safety Act, and it's not appearing under the Canadian Transportation Agency. Well, this old screen print on the left that I had done for a presentation pertaining to the fact that the chair of the Canadian Transportation Agency was a man by the name of Jeffrey Hare, who was a former CP Rail executive, and after leaving as chairman of the Canadian Transportation Agency, he was there from 2007 to 2015. He went back to CP Rail to be an executive again at CP Rail. And so we had the fox in charge of the hen house when it comes to frontline rail worker training programs. Not exactly in the interest of a rail executive to do compliance audits to make sure people aren't being fake qualified, and to look into any issues pertaining to frontline training programs and modifications and violations of the Railway Safety Act and on and on and on. But this old screen print absolutely proves that the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150, fell that the Enabling Act was clearly the Canada Transportation Act. And again, this was part of a presentation that I had done back in earlier 2024. I think it was either June or August of 2024. Then, now in December of 2024, Chrystia Freeland, who's now Minister of Transportation, this was published in the Canada Gazette, basically the same weekend that Chrystia Freeland supposedly threw Trudeau under the bus. Look at some of my previous videos for that. I think that was all perfectly planned and orchestrated. Divert the public, don't let them know what's going on in the background. I think that was a complete and total orchestration and drama queen scenario so that she could become Minister of Transportation to address these issues in the transportation industry, because the government of Canada and former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, has been hiding these issues for well over 6 years. And she's going to pretend to be the hero to overhaul this. Chrystia Freeland, whatever she knew of the rail industry before she decided to, before this got published in the Canada Gazette, which was before she became Transport Minister, well, she had received thousands of pages from me. She was Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. She was not the Minister of Transportation, but she was absolutely on my distribution list for over 6 years. And so she knew the liabilities for the government of Canada were massive, especially now that U.S. rail companies were impacted because Canada failed to prosecute and bring to accountability all their rail partners in crime and allowed them to escape to impact no less than 5 U.S. Class 1 rail carriers. And with the big rail unions in the U.S. now involved and knowing of these issues, I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on the government of Canada to clean up its act. And that's what you're seeing here. They're trying to limit their liabilities by making things, updating them. But, you know, are we taking a crisis to try and water down rules and regulations and laws? That's what I'm going to be looking for. I'm going to be looking very closely at her new regulation, which she plans on calling the Railway Personnel Training and Qualifications Regulation. So kind of using very much the same words as the other two, QSOC and SOR 87-150. We're going to kind of combine the words now in the name of our new regulation to make it even more confusing for the public, but that's going to be the new name of it. But whatever, you can see from the green arrows here that we're going from the Canada Transportation Act to the new regulation is going to fall under the Railway Safety Act, which is where I argued all along that it belonged. And that's why they're moving it, because they know they've been caught. They know they've been caught violating the law themselves, that they were violating Section 20 of the Railway Safety Act, having to do with the approval of all training program changes. Transport Canada did not do its job in decades. And that is what, in my opinion, contributes to deaths of frontline rail workers. Okay, so what we have here is a page that I received via Freedom of Information request, and it's a page from the Canada Gazette. And at the bottom arrow there shows the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150, which came into effect in March of 1987. There is nowhere on this page a regulation called Qualification Standards for Operating Crews. If it came into effect in March of 1987, it should be on this page. It's not there. The only thing that is there is SOR 87-150. And I got to tell you, in going back and looking at all this Mackyard stuff and doing these videos, I had not noticed previously the green, where I have the green arrow there. That shows regulation number 0.8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules. That's a regulation, regulation number 0-8. That's a key regulation. And the fact that this is there and it's never been repealed proves that the Canadian Rail operating rules were illegally implemented, because those were brought in to supposedly replace Regulation 0-8, Uniform Code of Operating Rules. That regulation has never been repealed, and that absolutely means the Canadian Rail operating rules were illegally implemented, and that has huge implications for the government of Canada and all those rail carriers, because if you've had a redefinition of terms, like the word transfer, for example, well, in the old regulations and stuff, a transfer used to be, this regulation dates back to 1962, by the way, and it's never been repealed. It is still part of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation SOR 87-150 as part of Appendix 14. You'll see it there. Never been repealed, because that regulation at the bottom has never been repealed and never been changed or modified in 38 years. So let's say that I changed a definition of a yard or a transfer. That has huge implications when it comes to the liabilities for the government of Canada. A transfer used to be a piece of paper to go from one train to another, a passenger train. Now they define it as a train operating at under 15 miles an hour, working like in a yard, or, in OCS, occupancy controlled systems territory. And if it's a supposed transfer, well, they don't need to have what's called an end of train unit or an SBU on the back. Well, wait a minute, your definition of a transfer is illegal, because a transfer meant something else under Regulation 0-8. And so you can't use the same word to mean something different. And so there is no such thing as a transfer referring to a train operating at under 15 miles an hour. And that means it's just a train. And if it's just a train, does that mean it needed an SBU on the back? An end of unit? That flashing red light? And if it did, and there wasn't one on that train when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed, or in any rail operations, maybe happening at night when a rail worker gets injured or killed, the implications of that could be absolutely massive for the corrupt government of Canada. And likewise, in any railway investigation report pertaining to any, issues with dangerous goods, any issues with rail workers having been injured or killed in the rail industry since 1987. Given that the Canadian Rail operating rules were illegally implemented, they can't put in a railway investigation report, well, you violated Rule 104 or whatever. Those Canadian Rail operating rules were said to have replaced Regulation 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules, but that was never repealed. And this is proof of it. If you look at all the block of things that fell under this Uniform Code of Operating Rules, those are all changes to that regulation that were done per this Canada Gazette thing. But this does not fall under repealed regulations. Oh no, these are active regulations. And so the Canadian Rail operating rules were illegally implemented. And so, oh geez, can I say that conductor trainee Jason Clooney was violating Canadian Rail operating rule, which is just a rule. It's not a regulation. A regulation is enforceable in court. Rules are generally not. Regulations and acts absolutely are. And so even though the rail industry and Transport Canada tried to bring this in and pull the wool over everybody's eyes, and now we make it look like, oh, this person violated this rule, and this person died because they violated this rule. Wait a minute. When they try and argue that conductor trainee Jason Clooney violated Rule 104 of the Canadian Rail Operating Rules, I'm sorry. There's a lot of other things that fit into that if you look at the deadly training materials, including deadly training slide number 53. But your Canadian Rail Operating Rules were not even valid. They were implemented illegally. So, can we go back and look at every accident that's happened in the rail industry, every injury, every death, where it was attributed to a violation of a railway Canadian Rail Operating Rule violation, and say, sorry, your argument's not valid. Those rules were illegally implemented. Can you see how the liabilities for the Government of Canada can be absolutely massive? Because Transport Canada failed to do its job for decades. And people have been dying because Transport Canada failed to do its job for decades. And that's why they're now overhauling the Railway Employee Qualification Standards regulation after 38 years. It's because of all the pressure going on behind the scenes. Thousands of pages from me, not just to Canadian regulators, but to U.S. regulators under the Trump administration and to U.S. rail unions. So I'm sure there's a lot of pressure on our now Minister of Transportation, Chrystia Freeland, who, again, as Minister of Finance, honey, in my opinion, as an MA in Finance, with you hiding all these issues from the people of Canada and all rail investors, in my opinion, you're not only guilty of breach of public trust, but also financial fraud for all those rail investors from whom the Government of Canada has been hiding all its corruption and all its breach of public trust. And those are criminal offenses. So here I just went ahead and I blew up that page from the Canada Gazette, which is the Government of Canada's official publication. When there's changes to laws, this is where they appear, in the Canada Gazette. So I blew it up so that you could make it out a little more. It's, they give you information and they make it blurry because we just don't want you to be able to read what we're giving you when we do freedom of information requests and stuff, right? I've had so much stuff that was so hard to read that was given to me. But anyways, you can make out here under the green arrow, Regulation 0-8 says Uniform Code of Operating Rules. And so that is absolutely a current regulation, never repealed. So Government of Canada's in a lot of trouble over this one. Okay, and blowing up the rest of the page here, you can see from the names on here, the only regulation, the large red arrow on the left, points to the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which is, if you look at the other arrows, SOR 87-150, which came into effect in March of 1987. There's that key date, March of 1987, as we saw in that very deceptive paragraph in the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to Mac Yard on page 20. But note what we don't see here. Look at the green arrow. Where is the QSOC? The Qualification Standards for Operating Crews Regulation. It's nowhere to be found. That thing does not exist. If it existed, and this regulation came out in March of 1987, and supposedly so did this QSOC, it should be on this page. It's not there. That's not the name of the real regulation pertaining to training programs for frontline rail workers. The real name is SOR 87-150, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. So what they're giving you in that page 20 paragraph is a complete and total deception, to divert your attention, make it harder for the public to figure out what's really going on behind the scenes. It's all a way to take the heat off of Transport Canada, which has, again, for decades, failed to do its job. All right, so this is the regulation that was hidden under the Canadian Transportation Agency, which administered the Canada Transportation Act. And if you see, the name of the regulation is clearly the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, SOR 87-150. The 87 is the year it came into effect. And nowhere in the name of the actual regulations do you see the words for operating crews or QSOC. Nowhere. And that's because this regulation also talks about certain standards for instructors and, people who may not be on the train itself. And so there should be no operating crews wording anywhere in any, railway investigation report when it comes to this regulation and its proper name. And the other thing you want to look at here is Schedule 14, Section 14, again, of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. Note, point number 1, Regulation number 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules. This is where we're going to get into why I call the first attempt to overhaul this regulation back after the Mackyard incident. That's what the Mackyard incident triggered. The first attempt to overhaul this regulation. And it was a complete and total public scam. We're going to get into those issues in separate videos, but I'm going to give you some of the highlights right here. Where it says Regulation number 0-8, Uniform Code of Operating Rules, they tried to change that to the Canadian Rail Operating Rules. This was a regulation within a regulation. They tried to change it to just a rule by putting a Canadian Rail Operating Rule, which is not necessarily enforceable in court, very much to the advantage of rail carriers, right? Because if it's only a rule, well, I really, that per the Government of Canada's own websites, rules are not generally enforceable in court. Regulations absolutely are. So that's one of the first public scams that they tried to do. Replace a regulation with just rules. But worse than that, in the first attempt to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, they also tried to take Railway Radio Regulations, another regulation, and put that under Canadian Rail Operating Rules. And worse still, they tried to put dangerous commodities and that training also under the Canadian Rail Operating Rules in the new public scam revised. And it was going to go, the new name would have been the Railway Rules Respecting Minimum Qualification Standards for Operating Employees. So we would have went from a regulation to just rules. And then we would have watered it down even more by changing railway radio regulations and putting that just under rules. And then taking dangerous commodities and putting that just under rules. A complete and total scam of the public, watering down, an attempt to further water down critical regulation for the safety not only of frontline rail workers, but of the public in general and of rail investors and rail customers. And you'll note here in the occupational categories, there is nothing for rail traffic control, remote control locomotive operators or belt pack operators, or for track workers. There's never been anything in the regulation for those occupational categories. Why not? Not in 38 years, in spite of all the accidents that have killed belt pack operators or injured them, in spite of issues with train collisions. You shouldn't have a train. Should you have a train collision if rail traffic control is properly trained? Should two trains be hitting one another? That has happened. There's been issues with rail traffic control, but there's also track workers. How many track workers have been killed? No standard, training. There's a lot of issues. You need to look at all the videos that I provide as far as operational excellence and deadly training materials, because there is so much more that fits into all of this. And it all goes back, in my opinion, to the Mackyard incident, which launched the first attempt to overhaul training programs, and also, I would argue, even earlier than that, because critical laws were never there, and worse, there were violations of the Railway Safety Act. And I think that one dates back to 1985, and Transport Canada allowed all these violations to go on and on and on. Violations of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20 specifically, which required all changes be first filed and approved by Transport Canada prior to field implementation. And another reason that you can see the deception in all of this is that first attempt to overhaul the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, it resulted in this new document called the Rules Respecting Minimum Qualification Standards for Operating Crews, a rules-only document. Even the Railway Association of Canada, and that's going to be another video I have to do on the Railway Association of Canada, because they were a big party in coming up with that first attempt to overhaul this regulation and make it just a rule, that total public scam. But anyways, even on their own website, on the Railway Association of Canada, even though that first attempt never became a regulation or a law or a rule that went into effect, because this regulation was never repealed, and neither was Regulation 8 or 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules. And so unless the regulations are first repealed, the rules, new rules that are supposed to replace the regulation, cannot go into effect. And so, but on their website, years later, the Railway Association of Canada was still showing their bogus rules respecting minimum qualification standards instead of this regulation. Why would you be showing rules that never went into effect on the Railway Association of Canada website for years, if not to deceive? That's my humble opinion. You're free to form your own. I've just seen too much to trust the Government of Canada or Transport Canada or the Transportation Safety Board or the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada in anything when it comes to the safety of frontline rail workers, of the public, of rail investors, and of rail customers. That's how bad all of this really is. And when you start putting all these pieces together, you just see how corrupt it truly is. Because they took the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, as an opportunity to try and water down this critical regulation, violating it by setting nasty precedents that violated this particular regulation, specifically Section 5, through the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada decision pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Another set of videos I need to do. So the Department of Justice, all of them, corrupt to the core, in my humble opinion. And never waste a good opportunity or a crisis. Never waste a crisis. Oh, the Mackyard incident was a crisis, revealed fake qualifications big time. So they attempted to use that to rewrite the regulation as a rule and, you know, put dangerous goods, radio regulations, get rid of all the regulation and make it just rules. Never waste a good opportunity. That's rail carrier executives for you, and that's Transport Canada for you. Because that new document, the rules respecting minimum qualification standards, that public scam of a document was actually approved by Transport Canada on June 6th, I believe, of 2009. Wow. Unbelievable. You're supposed to be there to protect frontline rail workers at Transport Canada, protect the public, protect rail investors and rail customers, and instead you're a rail partner in crime helping to water down key regulations. That's Transport Canada, a rail partner in crime, and their liabilities, in my opinion, are simply massive. All right, so if you look at what is in the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, under Section 19 here, you can see that it says a railway company shall establish employee training programs for each occupational category. How is it that rail traffic control, remote control locomotive operator, and track workers are not occupational categories? For the rail industry, and safety critical occupational categories? Why were they never included in this regulation ever in 38 years? And then it says a railway company shall establish and modify its employee training programs in consultation with the trade unions representing its employees in the occupational categories. Again, all of those workers would be part of unions. So seems they would fit that bill too. Then it says, this is the critical difference. Within 90 days after coming into force of these regulations, a railway company shall file with the committee a description of all employee training programs related to each occupational category. So that's only you need to file with this committee. Is the committee, the Minister of Transportation, or is it the Canadian Transportation Agency? It doesn't say. But this is just you need to file within 90 days of implementation. That doesn't mean that you can just go ahead and implement any changes as you want to as a rail carrier and then just file your changes with this committee or with Transport Canada. This is a regulation. The Act overrides this regulation, and the Act says that any changes to frontline rail worker training programs must first be filed with Transport Canada for prior review and approval prior to field implementation. So you can't just read this regulation, which is what they would love you to do as they try and steer you away from the Railway Safety Act during these, deceptions, as we see on page 20 of the Mackyard incident in that one paragraph when they say, that they need to file with whatever and whatever. If they're referring to these provisions and trying to, steer people to these two provisions here of file within 90 days any changes made to an employee training program required by subsection 1, a railway company shall file with the committee a description of the change. If they're referring people to these two, section 19, parts 3 and 4, again, it's a deception. Why are they referring you to the regulation and not to an act? And they're not even referring you to the proper regulation because they're calling it the qualification standards for operating crews. That is a total deception in page 20 of that railway investigation report tied to Mackyard. And then they go into these reporting things here for each calendar year. Okay, so for once a year, you need to tell me a report that shall specify the total number of employees in each occupational category, the total number of employees who receive training in each occupational category, and the number of employees who received training and met the training requirements for each category, and the number who failed. What this doesn't tell you is how many of them received the training, passed the training, but then maybe within a year or two, they're no longer in the rail industry. I would say within a year. Where are they within a year, 15 months of having been qualified? Because in my opinion, rail carriers are churning the workforce because a trainee is a lot less expensive than a full-time rail worker. And that's something that, in my opinion, is going on over and over and over again. That you bring in all these trainees, you fake qualify them, get rid of them. Who's going to know the difference? Especially when you have Transport Canada and the Transportation Safety Board there to act as rail partners in crime, helping you with appropriate death cover-ups in matters pertaining to fake qualifications or violations of so many laws by rail carriers. So the whole issue of churning of the workforce would not be captured via these reporting standards and what's being required here. Where are the compliance audits that would capture things like churning of the workforce? And how long are these employees who were qualified staying with the company? And how many of them who were qualified are then let go and then a new batch comes in? How come they're not being given more training if they need more training? So, when you fake qualify someone, the law only requires you to keep those training records for the duration of employment. If I'm fake qualifying an employee, I can get rid of all those records. Who's going to know the difference? Who's going to know the difference? Unless via other methods you can get to who those employees were and do audits by actually taking witness testimony to prove what might be going on in the rail industry. Just my humble opinion. Then the last one here says any new or improved implementation in programs or whatever, or new technologies, that also would need to be filed with Transport Canada or whoever this committee is. I'm thinking Transport Canada or the Transportation Agency. But anyways, big issue here. Why are you not including RTC, RCLOs, and track workers as an occupational category, and haven't done so in 38 years? And there's so many issues with this. We're referring people to a regulation instead of the Act. The Act overrides these regulations as far as what is required when it comes to changes to frontline worker training programs. All right, now I had covered these particular materials in another video, but I want you to notice here, this is the Railway Safety Act, sections 18, 19, we go through up to 20 on the next page. But when you look at section 18, which has to do with regulations, it says that respecting the operation, that you can make regulations respecting the operation or maintenance of line works. Well, that would include, frontline track maintenance workers. They could declare which positions in railway companies are critical to safe rail operations. Well, I would think that would include rail traffic control, remote control locomotive operators, and also track maintenance workers. Again, why are they not included in the regulation pertaining to training programs? Then if you look here, so 18.1 also definitely includes changes to training programs or making training programs for those persons both before and after appointment to those positions. And also there's the whole issue of hours of work and rest periods. That's a whole other issue as far as videos and stuff. But they also have provisions in here for the establishment of a scheme for licensing, and also the governor and council, which would include the Minister of Transportation, may make regulations respecting the security of railway transportation. Now, if you look at section 20 here, okay, this is the key one. A company shall file with the minister for approval any rules in respect to any matter referred to in subsection 18.1, which, as we just saw, includes training programs under point I, under C number 1, or 2-1.1, that it proposes to formulate in or revise on its own initiative. So if a rail carrier on its own decides to make changes to frontline rail worker training programs, Section 20 mandates that they must first file that with Transport Canada for prior review and approval prior to field implementation. So you don't just get to go out there as rail carriers and pretend that the regulation which says we only need to file with Transport Canada are changes within 90 days. That's not how it works. The Act overrides the regulation SOR 87-150. And so in that Transportation Safety Board report, they should have been referring you to the Act, not the regulation. Oh, but we want to steer clear of the Act in those investigation reports because that just might show how much Transport Canada hasn't been doing its job for decades. So again, if you look in the Railway Safety Act on page 38 of 95 pages, you can see a section called Consideration of Rules. And under that, you can see the second arrow there, the green one that says the minister who either approves the rules, either absolutely or in terms and conditions that are specified in the notice, or if the minister is not so satisfied, then he has to tell them why he's not satisfied. So there are definitely specific procedures that must be followed when rail carriers want to make changes to frontline rail worker training programs. They don't just get to go ahead and make their changes and then they just have to inform Transport Canada after the fact. That's not how it works. The Act overrides the regulation, and this is the Railway Safety Act. It's a 95-page document. It's not the short little regulation, which I think is only about 6 or 7 pages long. So, and if you look here, let's see, they talk about amendments, and on page 39, where the blue arrows are, it says the effective date. Rules approved by the minister under subsection 4 come into force on a date specified by the minister. But here's the key part. If they replace any regulations, they may not come into force earlier than the date on which the regulations are repealed. And that, folks, is why the Canadian Rail operating rules were implemented illegally. Because Regulation 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules, which is still part of Appendix 4 as a regulation within a regulation, namely SOR 87-150, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation. That regulation was never repealed. And so, based on the Railway Safety Act, in this particular section here on page 39 of 95, if new rules like the Canadian Rail operating rules are supposed to replace a regulation, as was the intent to replace the Regulation 0-8, the Uniform Code of Operating Rules, if the Uniform Code of Operating Rules is not repealed, the Canadian Rail operating rules cannot go into effect. And that's why that is making those rules completely illegal, basically. Or at least any parts that would be that would be contradictory for sure. Maybe it doesn't stop all the rules from coming into effect, but anything that would contradict or be different from the regulation would override the rules. So if there's a change in definitions, the regulations would override the rules, just as an act would override the regulations. And so that is an absolutely key point. And the other issue, the rest of this has to do with the what we saw before as far as the approval process. I just added those back, those sections back in here. But I have to tell you, when you look at safety actions taken in railway investigation reports, in my opinion, those are nothing more than a let's make the public think that we're actually working on this, when those safety actions taken, in my opinion, are often just more public scams. Because things like this, the first attempted overhaul of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, which happened after the Mackyard incident. That was nothing but a public scam, but oh, it sure makes us look like we've been working on it. And that's why they used that bogus new document, that public scam. Some of that was actually used in the death investigation report of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Because, oh, look, we were working on this, and then they pick and choose sections that they say they were working on, and then they plop it in another investigation report. And look, we were working on this, but it didn't go into effect. But we were working on it. Why would you ever include in a death investigation report bogus rules that were there to water down regulations and rules that especially never went into effect for years? Conductor trainee Jason Clooney died 5 years after those rules failed to go into effect. Why in the world would you include that in a death investigation report, if not to deceive? So, or to make the public think we're working on it. All these safety actions taken need to be watched a lot more closely than they actually are. And there needs to be compliance audits to see that steps that are supposed to be taken are actually taken and are done in the interest of the public, not the rail carriers. No watering down of key regulations, etc. There's just so many issues with safety actions taken. Oh, we put out a bulletin, somebody dies, and so CN Rail puts out a bulletin. Okay, well, what if you missed the bulletin or you weren't there when it was put out? Maybe it's included in your manual, but who's going to read it? Especially if it's really old and whatever, and and it doesn't go out to the entire rail company. Maybe it just goes out to one little region where the accident happened. There's a lot of issues with these safety actions taken in these railway investigation reports. Just my humble opinion. Okay, so, as much as I try to keep these videos shorter, there's just so much information that needs to be brought in and put together for people to understand the whole issue. And so, again, I put a lot of work into putting these together, and I hope that you will take the time to watch them. This impacts every single rail worker, every customer, every rail investor, member of the public, whatever. And taxpayers, we're all impacted by this in both Canada and the US now, because the players have moved around and are now, a lot of them in the US, impacting Class 1 rail carriers in the US. And so I will end part 8 here. And I think you can kind of see how Transport Canada's kind of been dropping the ball for a very long time, but we're going to be getting into more of this. And we will go from there. So I will see you in part 9. And on that note, have a great day.